This is one of those videos I'll probably regret making later, but things have gotten so out of hand that I just couldn't resist. For those, who are watching this video, you're probably aware of all the sort of back and forth things going on about why atheism should be, how it should be defined, whether babies are atheists, etc., etc. And so I decided to make this video to sort of add my 2 cents. But in part of this, some of this is serious, and some of it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. But everyone is being so high-minded about it. I thought at least the title would sort of give some indication of my opinion. Although I briefly had thought of perhaps trying to give it something a little more pretentious, to reflect the faux seriousness of the whole thing, something like, say, defining atheism with an application to the theistic status of cognizantly challenged humanoids, but I think better to just stick with defining atheism in babies too. This video will be a response to Rational Roundtable's response to Bionic Dance. The first one. I didn't know there's been a series, but I believe it was the first one. And basically, I'm pretty much in agreement with him. What I want to do in this video, however, is just address one issue, and I want to make very, very clear what's happening at each step. I tried doing this in the past in a video, and this is one of the reasons I said I live to regret this, is that a lot of people misunderstood what I was saying, and granted, because of the 15-minute time limit, I think that I cut a lot of corners and got a little sloppy, and I think that part of it was my own fault, but part of it was that there was sort of waving the red cape in front of bulls, and they went after anything, even if it was irrelevant to the discussion. So that where it was basically just pointing things out and not actually using it to draw conclusions. And I'll get to some of that as we move along, but I want to be more careful this time and make clear what it is I'm trying to accomplish. And basically what it comes down to is there are some, and I want to make clear this is not all atheists on YouTube, or not even necessarily most atheists, since I don't watch most atheist channels, but I've seen some whose insistence on a particular definition of atheism has reached almost the level of a religious dogma, where it's not only that they say this is what they believe to be the correct definition, but that basically the other definition, one that many theists use, is illegitimate. It is wrong. It is terrible, a terrible thing, or irrational. And in fact, what I'm going to try to demonstrate in this is that belief, not necessarily the atheist definition of atheism, but the belief that that definition is the only one that could possibly exist, is in fact irrational. That it has its only basis is emotional, or logistical, in the sense that it's an attempt to, as Rational Roundtable would put it, to have a strategic advantage by claiming the default position, and that basically is it. There is no real reason for this to be the only definition. So that's where we're going with this. So I want to be very, very clear. I'm not saying the definition cannot be used, but what I'm saying is that those who claim this is the only definition, or even that it's the most common definition, well, that's not really quite right. And what I'm going to do is sort of explain some things and go through them, and go through some of the arguments that I've seen. And I'm not saying, and again, when I go through these arguments, I'm not saying that all atheists use them, or even the majority of them. They are just the arguments, when I've tried to make this point, the responses that I've gotten. So I want to, be very transparent about everything, so everyone's you're following what I'm saying and not making assumptions that I'm not actually trying to convey. So let's get to the issue. the two definitions that are bandied about, the first is by atheists, or most commonly defended by atheists, which basically states that atheism is a lack of belief in a god or gods. And this definition essentially conveys it as not a belief itself, but a lack of belief. In this case, a lack of theism. So it's essentially not an active but a passive thing. It's simply they lack the belief in one or more deities. Many Christians will insist that rather than a lack of belief in God, it is a belief in the lack of God. That in fact atheism is a denial of God's existence, which is an active belief. And this essentially is where the argument is how you define it. Now, it basically is a kind of a silly thing that's going on, because you're dealing with semantics, and each is trying to have some logistical advantage, with atheists trying to define themselves to have the default position, whereas the theists are trying to have that default position as a neutral one. So that's essentially where the argument's going, and and of course in that theistic position, that what they're arguing for, the babies of course would fall into that segment that's essentially being argued over. So what I'm going to do now is kind of go through the logical structure of the arguments and then go through the various definitions. One of the concepts I'll be bringing into this discussion is that of modal logic. Now, this is one of the issues where I received objections for something that really shouldn't have been objected to, as I pointed out. This is one of those things where people were objecting to something that was basically stating facts and not really, and in fact I was not using the modal logic to draw any conclusions about the definition of atheism. I was merely using it to illustrate the difference in the definitions, and basically using the logical structure to illustrate that definition. Among the objections I had was there was one particular individual who insisted that modal logic had nothing to do with beliefs, and I pointed out that in fact belief was a modality, and that a modality is something that qualifies a sentence. A most common modality, of course, are things like necessity and possibility, that the logic of necessity and possibility. But there's also things like tense logic that deals with temporal issues, deontic logic that deals with things like obligation and permission, and in the case that we'll be dealing with, something known as doxastic logic, which deals with issues of beliefs. The person continued to insist that modal logic was not applicable to this issue, but of course it's all kind of silly since people have written books on the topic. And if you're going to insist that, please Google doxastic logic first before you make a complete fool of yourself. Now, the form of doxastic logic I'll be using here is very, very rudimentary, since I'm not trying to make deductions with it, but merely illustrate the logical structure of the propositions. There are other versions that, for example, there's this that have second order. Basically they quantify over propositions, and don't have to deal with that. Don't have to deal. Some doxastic logics have variables for the person who's believing, and there could be different ones. Don't have to deal with that, since we're assuming basically a single individual, or at least a consensus of some sort. So this is going to be really basic, but what I want to do is just to illustrate the differences. There's also one other thing people were confused by, and that's the fact that you end up with 4 different things. And one person insisted, well, we should only have those who believe God, those who deny God, and then basically the undecideds, those who neither affirm nor deny God. which those are in fact three distinct groups. But the problem is when you're dealing with propositional logic, it is binary. So the choices you have are going to be powers of two. So you can have, for example, those who believe God, and then everyone else, and you can have those who deny God, and then everyone else. And essentially, then you have to use those four possibilities to define the group that does neither. But that's just the way propositional logic works, and it essentially that middle group will have to be defined using the others, and we'll get to that in a minute. So let's see how this works. First of all, we're going to have a basic proposition G that there is a God exists. Now this is a statement of fact rather than belief, so either a God exists or no God exists, and God doesn't exist. So not G would be that a God doesn't exist. Again, this is a statement of fact, not a statement of belief, these propositions. Now, the modal operator B, which will stand for belief in, when we put B in front of G, we get belief in a God. And when we have B in front of not G, it's basically a belief in the non-existence of God. So the B not G would be what sometimes is called the strong definition of atheism, and the one that many theists argue for. BG, of course, is just theism by definition. Both of these, because you notice it begins with a B, it's a positive belief statement. Both of these are positive statements of belief. These are not passive. These are an active statement of belief. Now then there are the negation of each of these. So the first one, of course, what I mentioned, BG is the affirmation, a belief in an affirmation. B not G is a denial, basically in the active belief in the denial of God. Now not BG, which is the third choice, does not affirm a belief in God. This would be what atheists would prefer as the definition of atheism, or what they normally argue for, which is a non-affirmation of the existence of God. And then the final choice, which is not B, not G, is a non-denial of the existence of God. Basically, they're not denying the existence of God, so that would include those who neither affirm nor deny, and those who affirm. So it would be the opposite of strong atheism in essence. And this is essentially the four choices you're given these operators. So what we have to do then is, as I mentioned, define how do you get this middle group that we're arguing over. That group that neither affirms nor denies, and there is in fact a way of defining it with these operators. The simplest way of doing it is simply take the first group, the believers, the theists, which is BG, and then you take the deniers, which is the strong, what you sometimes is called strong definition of atheism, which is the B not G, and you simply say, I'm not either one of those. This group is neither one of those. So what you get is those who are not part of either one. Basically, you take what looks like a V is the or sign, so the theist and the strong atheist, if you want to call it, and you say either one of those, not either one of those, and that basically would give you the undecideds. Another way of defining it, which is essentially logically equivalent, and it relies on, for those familiar with propositional logic, it's De Morgan's laws. Another way of having it is to say, I'm not an affirmer and I'm not a denier. So you basically do it in terms of and rather than in terms of or, and you get those who are not believers and the ampersand represents and, so it's those who are not believers and those who are not deniers. And this has importance for the argument that's going on, of course, because that group there, that group of undecideds, using either of those equivalent definitions, includes, of course, Babies! Now that we're done with the modal logic stuff, I want to go a little further into exactly where I fall on this. And it would be tempting to just kind of side with the theists and go, we're right, you're wrong, yeah. And I think that's pretty much the level that a lot of the arguments have been on both sides, with people just talking right past each other. And insisting their way or the highway, and of course, neither side is convinced. But basically, they're both preaching to the choir and saying, "Look at those people on the other side don't even know what atheism means." But that's not really the way to approach it. And I think the only way to do it is to be consistent. Basically, define atheism the way you would any other word. Now, for me, any word, atheism included, the meaning of the word is basically the definition of the word is the meaning conveyed when people use it. It's basically we share these words as part of a shared linguistic experience, and whatever the convention is that is brought to mind when we say that word, that's essentially its meaning, particularly with nouns. I mean, and verbs. It's a little trickier with prepositions, but basically with nouns, there's a meaning conveyed, and sometimes, because words can have multiple meanings, it's in context, but there is some usage. It's basically the way it is used and the meaning that people have, by convention, have agreed upon is really the definition. It's how the word is used. That's how dictionaries operate. And you can make points about the logical structures and the etymologies and things like that, but these things can change over time. I'm going to give a few examples. For example, one that's kind of close to home in this argument. You will, if you look at these videos on the internet dealing with this topic, come across a usage of the term agnostic for those who neither believe nor deny the existence of God. Now, agnostic, as originally defined, basically gnosis, knowledge, lack of knowledge, and since it was defined in the context of the theistic arguments, it was defined as basically you're either asserting that you do not know how a God, you do not have any experience or knowledge of the existence of God, or you think that knowledge, any sort of knowledge, is impossible. Now, what you will find, though, is, particularly in the United States, people have used it in this other sense for those who neither believe nor deny the existence of God. So it's basically become something about beliefs. Now, you could argue that, well, this is logically incorrect or etymologically incorrect, but in fact, that's the way people are using it in America. Now, it's interesting. As far as I know, it's only used that way in America, and I particularly, you'll find most of these videos using it that way to persons from the United States. And from what I'm getting, and I had some exchange with someone who's from Britain, and he was telling me, that's not the way they use the word over there, and I'll trust him on that nobody uses it that way, and I'll certainly trust him on that, and I think that's reflected. It's interesting, and I was just curious because I checked it. I happen to own a Kindle, and the Kindle comes with a form of it's a condensed form, I'm sure, but a form of the Oxford English and Oxford American dictionaries. And if you look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, it only defines agnosticism or agnostic as in terms of knowledge. But in the Oxford American Dictionary, it has both definitions. So apparently, for those who say you can't use it with that newer definition, apparently you can, but only if you're an American. So you see, things get defined by the way they're used. Now, there's another example is the word awful. Generally the word awful means terrible. That's how we use it. That's the way people use it now. It means something's awful. It means it's terrible. But originally, it meant something that filled you with awe. And that's when I was young. When I was a kid, I used to wonder why we were in church singing hymns about the awful presence of God. It seemed rather insulting, but apparently that's, these are older hymns, and the word and awful meant to be filled with awe. That the word then evolved to go from something that would fill you with awe, particularly normally used with God. Eventually it derived into something that was something extreme in any sense, and we still have a leftover sense of that in the adverbial form, awfully. So, for example, since I live on the East Coast, I can say it's awfully hot outside, which means extremely hot outside. But more recently, the word has evolved to get further, and basically the word awful we now use to mean terrible. So, again, logically, etymologically, the word means to be filled with awe, something that fills you with awe, but that's not the way people use it anymore. So does that mean we can never use the word awful to mean terrible? No, because that's now the way people use it. With that in mind, I now want to turn to the common arguments I've run across that basically assert that the only definition of atheism is a lack of theism, or a lack in the belief of God. Now remember, what I'm trying to point out is not that that this definition provided by atheists cannot be used, but that the assertion that it is the only definition is invalid. I fully admit that much of what I'm saying here can be turned in the other direction, and to insist that the theist's preferred definition can not be asserted to be the only legitimate one. And if some atheist wants to make a video like that, basically taking everything I've done and turning it the other way around, they are free to do it. But that's not the art, since that would be their case. This is my case. So I'm sort of arguing in one direction. An atheist is free. It's fully within their rights to take everything and turn it in the other direction as well. And I won't deny any of it. But with all this in mind, now let's get to these specific arguments. The first argument I will mention, and I will freely admit this is one I've only run across a few times, is basically it's an argument using authority, and the authority being the dictionary, which would be fine, and then they tell me that, well, you can look it up in a dictionary and you'll see they're right. Well, apparently this is only used by atheists who've never bothered to look it up in a dictionary. Because if you look it up in a dictionary, at least most dictionaries I've seen, you'll find both definitions. So it doesn't really settle anything. But I guess when they use it, it kind of sounds good to them. But obviously they haven't really looked it up in a dictionary. The next argument, and a far more substantial one, at least, there's certainly a lot more thought into it, is basically a logical argument that atheism logically means a lack of theism. And this one sounds a lot better, certainly, but what you have to understand about this sort of argument is you have to understand what logical structure is. A lot of people will think that words can only be formed in one way. So they're thinking theism means belief in God, lack of, or no belief in God, or lack of belief in God. So that sounds, logical. Problem is that you can combine sections of roots and prefixes and suffixes in different orders, and each one of them, logically speaking, each of these various combinations, you can end up with different meanings. Basically, if you're familiar with mathematical functions, which is something it would be logically similar to or analogous to, f of g of x is not necessarily the same as g of f of x. To see this, when we look at the word atheism, essentially you have one root word and then a prefix and a suffix. The root word theos would be the Greek theos, which means God. The the prefix "a" means no or lack of, and the suffix "ism" basically means a belief in something. So theos is the root, and then the other two essentially are functions upon the word that's formed. The problem is, depending on which order if you put the suffix first and then apply the prefix, you get one meaning, and if you put the prefix first and then apply the suffix, you get an entirely different meaning. For example, again, here we have, let's take atheism in one way. We start out with theos, God. We then apply ism, the suffix, and it becomes belief in God. And then we put "a" on theosism or theism, and it becomes a lack of belief in God. That would be the atheist definition, what you could call the weak version. However, if we then begin with theos again, and this time apply the prefix first, atheos, which is no God, and then apply the suffix ism, which is belief, it would be then a belief in atheos. And what is atheos? Atheos is no God, so it would be a belief in no God. In fact, when the word atheism enters the language, it in fact derives from the Greek atheos as an expression of the concept atheos-ism. That is, atheos meaning no God, and atheosism hence meaning a belief in no God. That is in fact the way the word enters the English language. And in fact, that's the way it pretty much was used, or at least assumed. And if I'm not mistaken, Bertrand Russell was the first to argue for the other definition. There may have been someone before, and so I'm sure someone will point it out if that were the case. But I believe it was Russell was the first one to argue otherwise. And in fact, if you read Russell's statement on the matter, he freely admits that the other what you would call the strong definition is the one that everyone was using, and he was trying to make a case for a redefining of the term. So obviously the convention at that point certainly was in favor of the strong definition. So again, the etymological argument fails. Now, one time when I made this point about the etymology, someone had come back that, well, you know, language basically it's an evolution of language argument, that language evolves and the original etymology is irrelevant. Okay, I'm fine with that. I mean, honestly, you know, I agree that, you know, the language evolves. In fact, that's a point I made earlier. However, to use this argument, then you basically have to accept the state of the language now. And does the state of the language now assert that the other definition, that what we would call the strong definition, is not being used anymore? Well, obviously, by the fact that that those insisting that it can't be used are berating people about it, they've obviously failed to convince people to stop using it that way. In fact, I would argue that, at least in the United States, which is the only place I'd be really, I don't know how things are in Britain at the moment, but at least in the United States, most people still still associate atheism with what we would call the strong definition. At least certainly the vast majority. And I'll grant you, a lot of that is because the vast majority identify themselves as Christians. I'm sure that has something to do with it, but again, that's the way the language is. So that's just the state of the language. So to make an argument based on the state of the language, you can't do that. And even if, let's say, in some future time, they've managed to badger enough people to convince them to stop using it that way, all that would say is that in that future date that would be correct, that would have no effect on our discussion now. So, you know, in the same way that you couldn't apply the current meaning of words back 200 or 300 years earlier, it's simply that would have no effect on the current discussion. Now, one time when I made this point about the etymology, someone had come back that, well, you know, language basically it's an evolution of language argument, that language evolves and the original etymology is irrelevant. Okay, I'm fine with that. I mean, honestly, you know, I agree that, you know, the language evolves. In fact, that's a point I made earlier. However, to use this argument, then you basically have to accept the state of the language now. Does the state of the language now assert that the other definition, that what we would call the strong definition, is not being used anymore? Well, obviously, by the fact that that those insisting that it can't be used are berating people about it, they've obviously failed to convince people to stop using it that way. In fact, I would argue that, at least in the United States, which is the only place I'd be really, I don't know how things are in Britain at the moment, but at least in the United States, most people still still associate atheism with what we would call the strong definition. At least certainly the vast majority. And I'll grant you, a lot of that is because the vast majority identify themselves as Christians. I'm sure that has something to do with it, but again, that's the way the language is. So that's just the state of the language. So to make an argument based on the state of the language, you can't do that. And even if, let's say, in some future time, they've managed to badger enough people to convince them to stop using it that way, all that would say is that in that future date that would be correct, that would have no effect on our discussion now. So, you know, in the same way that you couldn't apply the current meaning of words back 200 or 300 years earlier, it's simply that would have no effect on the current discussion. I would also point out, in terms of this will be a bit of a personal anecdote here. At one period of my life, mainly when I was in college, when I neither believed in the existence of God, nor did I, at that point, deny the existence of God. I was in that undecided category, and I knew a lot of people who were. And the people I knew in that group generally defined ourselves as agnostics. Now, again, remember, I'm an American, so here I'm using that American usage that apparently is unique to us folks in the 50 states. But we were pretty adamant we didn't want to be called atheists, and I think it's analogous to the same situation that happens with Christians who will say, yeah, I'm a Christian, and I have friends at that point who are Christians who say, I'm a Christian, but I'm not a fundamentalist. It's almost like they wanted to insist on insisting that, no, I'm not a fundamentalist, just like I would insist that, no, I'm not an atheist. I don't believe in God, but I'm not an atheist. And I think it has to do with, well, personal experiences, because unfortunately what most people will think of who are let's say, not Christians, a lot of times the people they will interact with are Christians who would badger them about it's sort of the stereotypical person who's trying to basically shove their beliefs down everyone's throats, and that's what a lot of people who are not Christians sort of have a stereotype. But at least in that, and similarly, I think a lot of people who would have defined themselves using the American uses of agnostic didn't want to be called atheists, because a lot of people had their opinion of atheists is often defined by the stereotypical Madeline Murray O'Hare type, because basically on both sides, the vast majority who really are willing to respect other people's opinions are overwhelmed in the marketplace by the loudest and often most obnoxious, and so the whole group gets tarred with that. Now, at least I will say that the Christians actually have a bit of an advantage, because the hardcore fundamentalist types that I was referring to often will want to shrink the to exclude other Christians from being, quote, true Christians. And I'm sure a lot of atheists who've been in exchanges with them will find it often occurs in forms of the no true Scotsman argument. Well, they're not a real Christian, and they'll exclude other people from being Christians and define the group smaller and smaller and smaller, and basically try to define other Christians out of Christianity. Sort of on the other side, of course, what I think happens with the atheists is they're, rather than excluding people who want, whereas the fundamentalists are excluding people who want to be called Christians, the atheists are including people who don't want to be called atheists. So it ends up being an interesting, I don't know if it be a contrapositive or something. It's just an interesting, the way things work out that way. But as I mentioned, I don't think this argument really holds much water. Now, I think it's important to make a distinction between what I just referred to as self-definition and what Rational Roundtable was speaking of as self-identification. Self-definition would allow atheists, in the case of atheism, to define atheism to include those who do not wish to be defined by that term. Self-identification would include only those who accept the term as defining them. Of course, a corollary to that is that self-identification would exclude babies as atheists, since babies are incapable of giving consent to being defined by that or any other term. So does it really matter? Well, I guess if you could argue that if I've been talking on for close to 40 minutes, I think it is by now, that it must matter to me, but I think that's more a function of me being opinionated than it being significant. As I said before, atheism should be defined like any other word. Basically, it's defined by its usage. It's defined by the meaning it conveys to the users of the language. And while the atheist's preferred definition is certainly significant enough, used widely enough to be legitimate, it is not the majority definition. And I don't really see that changing. I think part of it is still, at least in the United States certainly, those who fall into that undecided group, those who neither believe God exists nor deny God exists, that group doesn't want to be associated with that word. And I think that a lot of that, it may be unfair, but I think a lot of it's for the reasons I've already indicated earlier. And I don't see that changing significantly in the near future. And I think part of it certainly is that as atheism has become more and more associated with, let's say, folks like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who not only lack theism, but would prefer theism be eradicated from the face of the earth, that they really would like it to go away. They really don't like it at all. That it's difficult for people as atheism becomes associated with them. It's difficult for people to then see atheism as mere passive non-acceptance. And to be honest, if you say something, as Richard Dawkins has said, there almost certainly is no God. Well, that's actually a statement of belief. That is a statement of belief. That there's no way around it. Logically, that's a statement of belief. He believes there is no God. And it's kind of hard to if you're willing to accept that, while the weak definition of atheism would apply, the strong definition would also apply. And in fact, defines rather vocal members of the group, and hence people will associate the word with the most vocal people in the group. Like I said, Christianity may have an advantage because there's so many more Christians who aren't fundamentalists that they're not going to define themselves that way, since it's the majority of the country. But the fact remains that the either usage is perfectly legitimate. There is no reason to exclude what would be called the strong definition on any logical grounds. And so really the only thing left are either emotional appeals, or basically it's done strictly for logistical purposes. It has no, what you would consider, rational foundation for the exclusion of the strong definition of atheism. Thank you very much for your time.